Hypothalamus Artificial Intelligence, HI, and Research Center for Advanced Decision Technologies, RCADT, presents the conference. Artificial Neural Nets. The Artificial Intelligence Scientist. The Artificial Intelligence Scientist. One of the most famous neuroscientists. Santiago Ramón y Cajal was a Spanish physician and scientist, specializing in histology and pathological anatomy. He shared the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1906 with Camillo Golgi, in recognition of his work on the structure of the nervous system. Through his investigations into the mechanisms governing the morphology and connective processes of nerve cells, he developed a revolutionary new theory that came to be called the neuron doctrine, since brain tissue is composed of individual cells. Humanist, as well as scientist, he is considered the head of the so-called generation of sages. He is frequently cited as the father of neuroscience. In 1943, Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts created the concept of artificial neural networks. They published the article, A Logical Calculation of the Ideas Immanent in Nervous Activity. McCulloch and Pitts tried to explain how the brain could produce highly complex patterns, by using many basic cells that are connected. Neural networks were growing, and in practice they took the name of artificial intelligence. They were also called machine learning. Donald Olding Hebb is best known for his theory of Hebbian learning, which he introduced in his classic work The Organization of Behavior in 1949. Hebb has been described as the father of neuropsychology and neural networks. The central concept of Hebb's theory is summed up in the phrase, cells that fire together, wire together. According to this idea, when an A neuron is repeatedly involved in the activation of a B neuron, the synapses between them are strengthened. Hebb's theory has shown that learning does not increase the number of neurons, but it does increase the connectivity between them. Frank Rosenblatt, psychologist and computer scientist, develops the perceptron, one of the first artificial neural networks that allows pattern recognition from a two-layer computer learning network. In 1957 he developed the perceptron, one of the first artificial neural networks that allowed pattern recognition from a two-layer computer learning network. At Cornell's Aeronautical Laboratory, based on the first concepts of artificial neurons, he proposed the perceptron learning rule. Geoffrey Everest Hinton is a British-Canadian cognitive psychologist and computer scientist, most noted for his work on artificial neural networks. Hinton is considered as a godfather of artificial intelligence, having championed machine learning decades before it became mainstream. Recently, in a CBS chatbot, Hinton said that for several decades, he has been more interested in understanding the functioning of the brain than in building artificial intelligence algorithms. John Joseph Hopfield, born July 15, 1933, is an American physicist and emeritus professor at Princeton University, most widely known for his study of associative neural networks in 1982. He is known for the development of the Hopfield network. Before its invention, research in artificial intelligence, AI, was in a decay period or AI winter. Hopfield work revitalized large-scale interest in this field. In 2024 Hopfield, along with Geoffrey Hinton, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for their foundational contributions to machine learning, particularly through their work on artificial neural networks. He has been awarded various major physics awards for his work in multidisciplinary fields including condensed matter physics, statistical physics and biophysics. Jeff Hawkins is an advanced researcher in the application of neuroscience to the development of artificial intelligence. Hawkins is an American businessman, neuroscientist and engineer. He co-founded Palm Computing, where he co-created the Palm Pilot and Treo, and Handspring. He subsequently turned to work on neuroscience, founding the Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience in 2002. In 2005 he founded Numenta Incorporated, where he leads a team in efforts to reverse engineer the neocortex, and enable machine intelligence technology based on brain theory. He is the co-author of On Intelligence, 2004, which explains his memory prediction framework theory of the brain, and he is the author of A Thousand Brains, A New Theory of Intelligence, 2021, based on his research in neuroscience. As a result of his studies, Hawkins proposes the hierarchical temporal memory, HTM neuron, that is a biologically constrained machine intelligence technology, and The sparse artificial intelligence model. Artificial neural nets. A biological neural network is a complex system of interconnected neurons in the brain and nervous system that processes and transmits information through electrical and chemical signals. These networks are the basis of all cognitive functions, including thinking, memory, and learning, and are made up of billions of neurons that communicate through synapses. Structure and function. Neurons, the fundamental units of the network. The cell body, or soma, performs most of the computation. Synapses, the junctions where one neuron connects to another, allowing for the transmission of signals. Signal transmission, information travels along the neuron's axon as an electrical signal, which then triggers the release of chemical neurotransmitters across the synaptic gap to the next neuron. Processing, the brain's capacity for higher-level intelligence emerges from the intricate network of connections between individual neurons. The artificial neuron uses simplified models with a single output, focusing on numerical signal transformations through activation functions. Fixed mathematical weights that are adjusted during training but remain static during testing, and predefined pathways determined by network architecture and model design. Biological neural networks are flexible and capable of real-time learning. The artificial neural networks are simplified, task-specific systems that prioritize speed and precision. The ongoing research is to draw insights from brain to make artificial systems more adaptive and intelligent. An artificial neuron is the basic processing unit in artificial neural networks, ANN, inspired by biological neurons. It operates by calculating a weighted sum of its inputs and applying a trigger function to generate an output. These weights represent the strength of the connections and are adjusted during training. The components are inputs and weights, receive multiple entries, each multiplied by a weight indicating its importance. Weighted sum of all inputs multiplied by their respective weights. The result of the weighted sum goes through a nonlinear firing function, which determines whether and to what extent the neuron is fired and restricts the range of its output. The image presents the comparison of the structures of the biological neuron and the artificial neuron. Similarities. The entrance is on both left sides. Logic is applied or processing is done at the middle. After processing, an output is generated. Recently, an artificial neuron with an organic peak based on nonlinear ion electronic phenomena, sensitive to ionic and biomolecular species common in neuronal signaling. The neuron emulates the function and firing properties of biological neurons and enables biohybrid interfaces made of artificial and biological components that work in real time. The connectivity of an artificial neural network, or ANN, is defined by its interconnected nodes, or artificial neurons, which are organized into layers, an input layer, one or more hidden layers, and an output layer. Information flows from the input layer through the hidden layers to the output layer using weighted connections that control signal strength. During training, the network learns by adjusting these connection weights to minimize errors in its predictions. ANNs with hidden layers are called deep neural networks. Backpropagation is a key algorithm for training neural networks. Adjust network weights to minimize the error between the predicted output and the historical output. This process is done in two stages. First, the forward propagation calculates the output, and then the backpropagation of the error to calculate the gradient and update the weights. The steepest descent algorithm in artificial neural networks, better known as gradient descent. It is a fundamental optimization algorithm used to train ANNs by minimizing the loss, or error, function of the network. The goal is to find the set of optimal weights and biases for the network that minimizes the difference between the predicted output and the observation of the network. This difference is quantified by a loss function. At each step of the training process, the algorithm calculates the gradient of the loss function with respect to each of the parameters of the network, weights and biases. The slope indicates the direction of the steepest increase in the loss function. To minimize loss, the algorithm moves the parameters in the opposite direction of the slope, such as the steepest direction of descent. If the function to be optimized is convex, it will have a unique local minimum, which matches the global minimum. If it is not, there are several local minimums, and the result will be one of them. In this case, to obtain the global solution, the mathematics of the algorithm must be worked on. The total time is divided into 3 parts: training, validation, and prediction. The historical dataset is divided into 2 parts, training and validation, composed of training dataset, part of the historical sample used to train and calibrate the mathematical model, and test dataset, part of the historical sample that is not used to calibrate the model and is used to check the quality of the model. And the forecast period, in which the model will be used to predict new samples. A perceptron is a mathematical model and machine learning algorithm that simulates the functioning of a biological neuron and serves as the fundamental building block for neural networks. It is primarily used for binary classification tasks, separating data into 2 categories, by taking multiple weighted inputs, summing them up, and passing the result through a trigger function to produce a binary output. In 1957, Frank Rosenblatt designed and invented the perceptron. Starting from the perceptron, the first artificial neuron created, the knowledge of neuronal modeling has evolved, currently having multiple types of artificial neural nets, specialized in performing specific pattern recognition. For this, the basic patterns of ANNs are modified. The perceptron model is also known as a single-layer neural network. This neural network contains only 2 layers, input layer, output layer, and it has no hidden layers. It takes an input and calculates the weighted input for each node. It then uses an activation function, mainly sigmoid, for classification purposes. Radial basis networks, RBN, a type of network that uses radial basis functions as activation functions. They are often used for function approximation and pattern recognition. They can be distinguished from other neural networks because of their faster learning rate and universal approximation. The main difference between radial basis networks and feed-forward networks is that RBNs use a radial basis function as an activation function. They are often used for function approximation and pattern recognition. A deep feed-forward net uses more than one hidden layer. The main problem with using only one hidden layer is overfitting, so by adding more hidden layers we can achieve, not in all cases, a reduction in overfitting and improved generalization. A deep feed-forward net uses more than one hidden layer. The main problem with using only one hidden layer is overfitting, so by adding more hidden layers we can achieve, not in all cases, a reduction in overfitting and improved generalization. Long short-term memory, LSTM, is an RNN designed to manage long-term dependencies of sequential data. The RNNs consider the time delay but fail when they have a lot of relevant data, then LSTMs are the best option, overcoming the key limitations of basic RNNs. LSTM networks introduce a memory cell and can process data with memory gaps. Recurring gate units are a variation of LSTMs because they both have similar designs and mostly produce equally good results. GRUs only have 3 gates and do not maintain an internal cellular state. The operation is update gate, determines how much past knowledge to pass on to the future, reset gate, determines how much past knowledge to forget, and current memory gate, subpart of restarting the destination. An autoencoder, a neural network is an unsupervised machine learning algorithm, where the number of hidden cells is less than the input cells. An A network is trained to display the output, which is as close as possible to the fed input, forcing the A to find common patterns and generalize the data. The A is a smaller representation of the input, and it can reconstruct the original data from compressed data. The algorithm is relatively straightforward, as A requires the output to be equal to the input. The components are encoder, convert input data in lower dimensions, and decoder, reconstruct the compressed data. A variational autoencoder, VAE, uses a probabilistic approach for describing observations. It shows the probability distribution for each attribute in a feature set. In the autoencoder, A, the network cannot copy the input to its output because the input also contains random noise. Denoising autoencoder, DAE, is produced to reduce noise and generate meaningful data inside. DAE forces the hidden layer to learn more robust features so that the output is a more refined version of noisy input. Scarce autoencoder network, SAE, build the loss function by penalizing hidden layer activation so that only a few nodes are activated when a sample is introduced into the network. The logic of SAE is that, for example, if a person claims to be an expert in topics A, B, C, and D, then SAE might be more generalist in these topics. However, if the person claims to be an expert only in D, SAE anticipates perspectives derived from the knowledge they have on topic D. A Markov chain is a mathematical system that experiences the transition from one state to another based on some probabilistic rules. The probability of transitioning to any state is dependent solely on the current state, and time elapsed. In a Hopfield neural network, HN, every neuron relates to other neurons directly. In this network, a neuron is either on or off. The state of the neurons can change by receiving inputs from other neurons. Hopfield networks store patterns and memories. When trained with a set of patterns, HNs can recognize the pattern, even if it is somewhat distorted or incomplete, which returns the best guess. A Boltzmann machine network, BM, involves learning a probability distribution from an original dataset and using it to infer unseen data. In BMs, there are entry nodes and hidden nodes. Hidden nodes change state and become exit nodes. The Boltzmann restricted machine, RBM, is a variant of the BM. In this model, neurons in the input layer and the hidden layer can have symmetrical connections between them but does not have internal connections inside each layer. By contrast, Boltzmann machines may have internal connections in the hidden layer. These restrictions in BMs allow efficient training for the model. Deep belief networks, DBN, contain many hidden layers. DBNs is an unsupervised algorithm as it first learns without any supervision. The layers in a DBN act as feature detectors. After unsupervised training, the DBM can train monitoring methods to perform classification. A DBN can be represented as a composition of constrained Boltzmann machines, RBMs, and autoencoders, As. The most recent DBNs use a probabilistic approach towards their results. Deep convolutional networks, DCNs, are primarily used for image classification, image clustering, and object recognition, allowing for unsupervised construction of hierarchical representations of images. DCNs are used to add features that are much more complex than convolutional neural networks, CNNs, and thus perform the task more accurately. Deconvolutional networks, convolutional neural networks, CNNs, that operate in an inverted process. DN is like a CNN in terms of work, its application in AI is very different. DN networks help find missing features or signals in networks that were previously considered useful. A DN can lose a signal due to being convoluted with other signals and can take a vector and create an image from it. Deep convolutional reverse graphic networks, DCIGN, aim to relate graphic representations to images. DCIGN uses elements such as lighting, object placement, texture, and other aspects of image design for highly sophisticated image processing. It uses multiple layers to process input and output. DCIGN uses initial layers to encode through multiple convolutions, using max pooling, and then uses subsequent layers to decode with unwinding. Generative adversarial networks, GANs, used for generating new data that mimics a given dataset. They consist of two networks, a generator and a discriminator, that compete. GANs learn to generate new data with the same statistics as the training data. For example, if GAN trains on photographs, then the trained model will be able to generate new photographs that appear authentic to the human eye. The objective of GANs is to distinguish between real and synthetic results so that it can generate more authentic results. A liquid state machine, LSM, is a particular type of neural network with spikes. An LSM consists of a large collection of neurons. Each node receives inputs from an external source and from other nodes, which can vary over time. The nodes of LSMs are randomly connected to each other. In LSMs, the activation functions are replaced by threshold levels. When an LSM reaches the threshold level, a particular neuron emits its output. The echo state network, ESN, is a subtype of recurrent neural networks, where each input node receives a nonlinear signal. In ESN, hidden nodes are sparsely connected. The connectivity and weights of hidden nodes are randomly assigned. On ESNs, the final output weights are trainable and can be updated. Deep residual networks, DRNs, deep neural networks with many layers can be difficult to train and are time-consuming. It can also lead to degradation of the results. DRNs prevent degradation of results, even though they have many layers. Some parts of the inputs of a DRN go to the next layer. Therefore, these networks can be quite deep. Common networks, NOT, are unsupervised algorithms. NOT is also known as self-organizing maps, which is very useful when the data is scattered across many dimensions and only one or two are needed. NOT can be thought of as a dimensionality reduction method. KNs visualize high-dimensional data, use competitive learning instead of error-correcting learning. The Support Vector Machine Neural Network, SVM, is a hybrid algorithm of support vector machines and neural networks. SVM classifies data into two categories, yes or no, or 1 or 0. SVM are not generally considered as a neural network. A neural Turing machine, NTM, architecture contains two primary components. Neural network controller. Memory bank. The controller interacts with the external world through input and output vectors. It also performs selective read and write operations by interacting with the memory bank. A Turing machine is computationally equivalent to a modern computer. Therefore, NTMs extend the capabilities of standard neural networks by interacting with external memory. Convolutional neural networks. Convolutional neural networks, CNNs or ConvNets, are deep learning models specialized for processing grid-like data, like images, using convolutional layers with learnable filters, kernels, to automatically detect hierarchical patterns, from simple edges to complex objects, making them the standard for computer vision tasks like image recognition and classification, while also applicable to text and audio. They mimic the human visual cortex by processing local receptive fields and reducing parameters through shared weights, allowing them to achieve high accuracy with less pre-processing than traditional methods. Text built by AI Google. How do CNNs work?
Convolutional layers, filters slide over input, e.g., an image, creating scalar products to create feature maps that highlight patterns such as borders, textures, or shapes.
Feature hierarchy, the first layers detect basic features, while the deeper layers combine these to recognize more complex parts, eyes, wheels, and finally whole objects, faces, cars. Grouping layers, reduce the spatial dimensions, size, of feature maps, making the network more efficient and robust against small displacements in the position of objects. Fully connected layers, flatten final feature maps and connect them to traditional neural network layers for final classification or prediction. CNN's process should be interpreted as follows. The complete image is taken, in this case a zebra, which is filtered until a partial profile of the image is obtained, in this case the profile of an animal. It could be a horse, a dog or a zebra. It is assumed that this is the universe of animals to be classified. As the universe of animals grows, the size of CNN will grow. The pooling, or convolution process, ends with a flattening layer. From that moment on, the reconstruction of the image begins. Using a fully connected layer, the original image is selected, which can become a generic zebra or the specific zebra. This process is equivalent to an information integration process. The convolution is performed by functions of the ReLU kernel. The fully connected layer learns a nonlinear function in that space. Adding a fully connected layer is an inexpensive way to learn nonlinear combinations of the features represented by the output of the convolutional layer. The input image is converted into a shape suitable for a multilevel perceptron and can be flattened into a vector column. Flattened output feeds a neural network, and backpropagation is applied to each iteration of the training. The model can distinguish between dominant features and certain low-level features in images and classify them using the softmax classification technique. There are several CNN architectures available that have been key to building algorithms that drive and will drive AI for the foreseeable future. Integration is performed by the functions of the softmax kernel. The image shows the sequential connection of the two types of layers: pooling layer and fully connected layer. This video demonstrates the pattern recognition capabilities of CNNs. High associates image processing with mental intelligence and pattern recognition. Mental model is oriented to identify patterns, its foundations are not mathematical, and respond to data processing and evaluation of eventual and systematic experiences. It is based on good practices. Pattern recognition is a data analysis method that uses machine artificial intelligence algorithms to automatically recognize patterns and regularities in data. This data can be anything from text and images to sounds, or other definable qualities. Pattern recognition systems can recognize familiar patterns quickly and accurately. Pattern recognition is the activity that most performs the human being, for example, identifies images of people, foods, hydroclimatic conditions, traffic conditions, texts, sounds, and etc. All this with the aim of establishing the conditions of the environment, in the past, the present, and the future, and based on this knowledge make decisions. How the brain identifies patterns is not properly known, but it is mimicked by traditional artificial intelligence. Deep neural networks, DNNs, are based on neural networks composed of neurons with some activation and parameters that transform input data, such as UAV remote sensing images, into outputs, such as land use and land cover maps, while progressively learning higher level features. This progressive learning occurs in layers between input and output, which are known as hidden layers. A DNN architecture can be built from an initial layer, X input, composed of the collected data samples. Subsequently, this data information can be extracted through hidden layers in a backpropagation form that is used by the subsequent hidden layers to know the characteristics of these entities. At the end, another layer is used with a trigger function related to the given problem, returning a prediction result, Y-label. A DNN can be made up of different architectures, and the complexity of the model is related to how each layer is implemented. Different architectures are regularly proposed. Convolutional neural networks, CNNs, recurrent neural networks, RNNs. Deep belief networks, DBNs, Ball et al., and more recently R, and generative adversarial networks, GAN, Goodfellow et al. For image processing and pattern recognition, most of the current research focuses on CNNs. Since 2012, Krzyzewski demonstrated a method that won an image classification contest by a wide margin in his favor. The network, which came to be known as AlexNet, was built with 8 layers, in which the initial 5 layers were all convolutional, some followed by layers of maximum grouping, and finished with 3 fully connected layers, all use the ReLU activation function. The success of this method was associated with its depth. Neural networks have evolved to allow machines to recognize patterns, so that they appear to see the world as humans do, perceive it similarly, and use knowledge for a multitude of tasks such as image and video recognition, the analysis and classification of images, the recreation of media, recommendation systems, natural language processing, etc. Over time, advances in computer vision with deep learning have been built and refined, mainly on top of one algorithm in particular, the convolutional neural network. The architecture of a CNN is analogous to that of the connectivity pattern of neurons in the human brain and was inspired by the organization of the visual cortex. Individual neurons respond to stimuli only in a restricted region of the visual field known as the receptive field. A set of these fields overlap to cover the entire visual area. An image is an array of pixels in 2 dimensions, which can be flattened by a vector. A 3:3 matrix can be converted into a 9:1 vector, which feeds a multi-level perceptron for classification purposes. In cases of extremely basic binary images, the method could make predictions but would have little or no accuracy when dealing with complex images with pixel dependencies throughout the image. A CNN can successfully capture the spatial and temporal dependencies of an image by applying relevant filters. The architecture is better suited to the image dataset due to the reduction in the number of parameters involved and the reuse of weights. In other words, the network can be trained to improve the image. In the figure, we have an RGB, red, green, blue, image that has been separated by its three color planes, red, green, and blue. There are several color spaces in which images exist: grayscale, RGB, HSV, CMYK, etc. You can imagine how computationally intensive things would become once the images reach dimensions, say 8K, 7680 x 4320. CNN's role is to reduce images to a form that is easier to process, without losing features that are critical to getting a good prediction. This is important when we're going to design an architecture that's not only good for learning features but is also scalable to massive data sets. Convoluting a 551 image with a 331 kernel to obtain a 331 convoluted function. The image dimensions are equal to 5, height, per 5, width, per 1, number of channels. RGB A331 matrix is selected. The green section resembles the 551 input image. The element involved in the convolution operation in the first part of a convolutional layer is called the kernel or filter, represented in yellow. In the lower right corner, in red, the K-core is shown. The convolution operation consists of multiplying the floating part, numbers of the floating array in yellow, by the nucleus K in red, and adding the results. The nucleus is shifted 9 times due to stride length is equal 1, non-striated, each time a matrix multiplication operation is performed between K and the floating portion P of the image on which the nucleus is floating. The filter moves to the right with a certain stride value until it analyzes the full width. As you continue, jump to the beginning, left, of the image with the same step value and repeat the process until the entire image is covered. Convolution operation on an N3 image array with a 333 core. The filter moves to the right with a certain step size until it analyzes the entire width, at which point it jumps to the beginning, to the left, of the image with the same step and repeats the process until it goes through the entire image. For images with multiple channels, such as RGB, the core has the same depth as the input image. The multiplication of matrices is performed among all the pixels, and the results are summed with bias to obtain a convoluted output of a flattened channel of depth equal to 1. Convolution operation with stride length equal to. The goal of the convolution operation is to extract the high-level features, such as edges, from the input image. Convnets don't need to be limited to a single convolutional layer. Conventionally, the first CNN is responsible for capturing the low-level features like borders, color, gradient orientation, etc. With added layers, the architecture also incorporates high-level features, providing us with a network that has a healthy understanding of the images in the dataset, like how we would. There are two types of outcomes for the operation, one in which the convoluted feature is reduced in dimensionality relative to the input, and another in which the dimensionality increases or stays the same. This is done by applying the valid padding in the case of the former, or the same padding in the case of the latter. The video image processing using convolutional neural networks. Delve deeper into this topic. HTM artificial neurons. One of the scientists who has most influenced Hyde's work is Jeff Hawkins through his publications, such as Why Does the Neocortex Have Layers and Columns? A Theory of Learning the 3D Structure of the World, and his book 1,000 of Brains, in which Hawkins presents a vision of artificial neural networks based on neuroscientific studies. It was called HTM, Hierarchical Temporary Memory. Although in its beginnings traditional artificial intelligence did not look at neuroscientific studies as a fundamental support, there are currently clear trends of recognized researchers, who consider that neuroscientific studies should be the basis for understanding the functioning of neural networks in the brain. Neocortical regions are organized into columns and layers. The connections between layers are mostly perpendicular to the surface, suggesting a columnar functional organization. Some layers have long-range lateral connections that suggest interactions between columns. Similar patterns of connectivity exist across regions, but their exact function remains a mystery. Hawkins proposes a network model composed of columns and layers that performs robust object learning and recognition. The columns integrate their changing inputs over time to learn complete models of the objects observed. Lateral connections between columns allow the network to infer objects more quickly based on partial knowledge of adjacent columns. As columns integrate input across time and space, the network learns models of complex objects that extend far beyond the receptive field of individual cells. The network model introduces a function into the cortical columns, calculating the representation of the location within the subgranular layers of each column. The representation of the location is relative to the detected object. Pairing sensory features with locations is a requirement for modeling objects and therefore must occur somewhere in the neocortex. Hawkins proposes that it occur in each column of each region based on a network containing 2 layers and 1 or more columns. Given the ubiquity of columnar and laminar connectivity patterns throughout the neocortex, columns and regions possess powerful recognition and modeling capabilities. This section is based on the paper "Why Does the Neocortex Have Layers and Columns? A Theory of Learning the 3D Structure of the World." Neocortical regions are composed of columns and layers that performs robust object learning and recognition. Columns integrate their changing inputs over time to learn complete models of observed objects. Lateral connections across columns allow the network to more rapidly infer objects, based on the partial knowledge of adjacent columns. Because columns integrate input over time and space, the network learns models of complex objects that extend well beyond the receptive field of individual cells. Sparse artificial intelligence. The Hawkins network model introduces a new feature in cortical columns that proposes that a representation of location calculated within the subgranular layers of each column. The representation of location is relative to the object being sensed. Pairing sensory features with locations is a requirement for modeling objects and therefore must occur somewhere in the neocortex. Hawkins proposes it occurs in every column in every region. The network model contains 2 layers and 1 or more columns. Simulations show that small single-column networks can learn to recognize hundreds of complex multidimensional objects. Given the ubiquity of columnar and laminar connectivity patterns, the columns and regions have more powerful recognition and modeling capabilities than previously assumed. The image presents the comparison between the classical point of view and the vision of the theory developed by Hawkins. Thousand Brains theory of intelligence implies multiple models of an object. Each model depends on a point of view. All models work cooperatively to identify the object, or situation. The identification starts from the sampling process, and progresses until it finds that all the models converge, that is, they agree, and at that moment the object, or the situation, has been identified, and the process is done through the flow of information in the neocortical regions. Commonly accepted view of cortical hierarchy. Sensory input is processed in a hierarchy of cortical regions. The first region detects simple features, which have more complex features. This repeats until a region at the top of the hierarchy represents complete objects. Modified view of cortical hierarchy. Each column in each region learns complete models of objects, combining sensory input with object-centered placement that is integrated over the movements of the sensors. 2 sensory hierarchies are shown, one for vision and one for touch, both perceiving the same object, a cup. There are multiple objects within each region, in different regions within a sensory modality, and in different sensory modalities. Although there are many models of the same object, the models are not identical, as each model is learned through a different subset of sensory arrangements. The green arrows denote cortico-cortical connections, of numerical size, which are not hierarchical in nature, and are not projected within the region of origin, across hierarchical levels, between modalities, and between hemispheres. Typically, many columns simultaneously observe the same object. Non-hierarchical connections between columns allow you to quickly infer the correct object. Although learning objects requires moving the sensors, inference usually occurs without movement due to non-hierarchical connections. Thousand Brains theory of intelligence implies Multiple models of an object, each model depends on a point of view. All models work cooperatively to identify the object, or situation. The identification starts from the sampling process, and progresses until it finds that all the models converge, that is, they agree, and at that moment the object, or the situation, has been identified, and the process is done through the flow of information in the neocortical regions. Another important contribution of Hawkins is related to the multiple brain models of the same object working cooperatively. For example, to recognize an object, 5 models of that object can intervene, each of them generated by one of the senses that the human being enjoys. Complete knowledge occurs when the knowledge generated by all models in all layers are integrated. High has integrated Hawkins' concepts into artificial brains. The Spanish neuroscientist, histologist and artist Santiago Ramón y Cajal was fascinated by the brain. His complex and careful representations of the inner workings of this organ are still used in neuroscience to describe the neural structure that sustains human memory and thought. He is often called the father of modern neuroscience and the first cartographer of the brain, for his outstanding studies on the microscopic anatomy of the human being. The image presents neocortical region structure, produced by Santiago Ramón y Cajal in 1899. 3D reconstruction of 5 neighboring columns in rat vibrissae cortex. The neocortex is complex. Within its 2.5 mm of thickness are dozens of cell types, numerous layers, and intricate connectivity patterns. Connections between cells suggest a columnar flow of information across layers, as well as a laminar flow within some layers. The image presents the hierarchical distribution of neurons in the neocortex, joining brain, neocortical columns, simple neurons and ion channels. This is the starting point of the Hawkins model. The image presents the different aspects of the human cerebral cortex, which is divided into 6 layers. The images present the 6 layers of the cortex, in 2 and 3 dimensions. The image presents 3 structures of living beings: human, mouse, and ferret. Each structure is proportional to the size of the living being. The cortex is formed when newly hatched pyramidal cells migrate radially out of the proliferative zone to form layer 6 first and layer 2 last. Layer 1, which in adults is cell-free, originates in the marginal zone of the developing cortical plate. Each layer contains different shapes, sizes, and neuronal densities. They are numbered with surface to depth Roman numerals. Functionally, they are divided into 3 parts. Supragranular layers I to 3.
The supragranular layers are the origin and primary termination of intracortical connections, which are associated with other areas of the same hemisphere, or commissure, i.e., connections with the opposite hemisphere, through the corpus callosum.
It is highly developed in humans and allows communication between a part of the cortex and other regions. Layer 2, the molecular layer, contains very few neurons. It is the outer granular layer. Layer 3 is the outer pyramidal layer. Layers 2 and 3 are usually clustered due to the lack of a clear cytoarchitectural edge. Internal granular layer 4. It receives thalamocortical connections, especially from specific thalamic nuclei. This is most evident in the primary sensory cortices that receive stimuli from the thalamus. The neurons in these regions are organized into columns that represent specific regions of the body. If a region, such as a finger, is amputated, neurons reorganize themselves in response to stimulus from adjacent parts of the body. Infragranular layer 5 and 6. These layers connect the cerebral cortex with the subcortical regions, such as hippocampus, amygdala, striatum. They develop mainly in the motor cortical areas. Layer V gives rise to all major efferent cortical projections to the basal ganglia, brainstem, and spinal cord. Layer V, the fusiform layer, projects mainly towards the thalamus, has reciprocal communication with layers 4 and 5 independently. Different layers have different neural morphologies and functions and develop at different stages of development. X-axis, for example, 10.5 represents embryonic day 10.5. The image presents 3 stages of cortex formation, which migrate in size as each layer evolves, containing different shapes, sizes and neuronal densities. Functionally, these steps are divided into primary sensory cortex, associative cortex, and primary motor cortex. In summary, the modeling of the structure of neocortical regions is organized into columns and layers. Connections between layers run mostly perpendicular to the surface, suggesting a columnar functional organization. Some layers have long-range lateral connections, suggesting interactions between columns. Similar patterns of connectivity exist in all regions, but their exact role remain a mystery. All regions have a motor output. Hierarchical temporal memory, HTM, is a biologically constrained machine intelligence technology developed by Numenta. Hawkins' work gives rise to the HTM neuron, that is intended to emulate the overall structural and functionality of the human neocortex. The main properties of HTM is hierarchical structure, sparsity and modularity. Hawkins proposes the concept of regions, groups of cells organized hierarchically, interconnected, but with a low density of links, sparse. This is the fundamental representation of the 3D connectivity of neurons in the neocortex. This structure has the same characteristics as those generated when a monolithic model is divided and decomposed into an atomized model, to process it in parallel. Hawkins proposes the concept of regions, groups of cells organized hierarchically, interconnected, but with a low density of links, sparse. The figure shows the hierarchical organization of the neocortical structure proposed by Hawkins, which is made up of synapses, cells, columns, or regions, and level. The graph on the features multiple levels, or layers of the same structure. The image presents the traditional neuron, the pyramidal neuron and the HTM neuron. Cellular activations in the input and output layers of a single column during a sequence of touches on two objects, cube and wedge, and their associated representations in the output layer. For each object, 3 pairs of localization features are shown. F1 and F3 are common to both the cube and the wedge. The activations both layers are caused by a sequence of 3 taps on the cube, in temporal order from top to bottom. The first touch, at F1, results in a set of active cells on the input layer, black dots. The cells of the output layer receive this representation through their connections, black arrows. Since the input is ambiguous, the output layer forms a representation that is the junction of the cube and the wedge, black dots on the output layer. Feedback from the output layer to the input layer, red arrows, causes the location features associated with both objects to be predicted, red dots. The second touch, at F2, results in a new set of active cells in the input layer. Since F2 is not shared with the wedge, the representation in the output layer is reduced to the cube only. The set of predicted cells in the input layer is also reduced to the cube's feature location pairs. The third touch, on F3, would be ambiguous on its own. However, due to the past sequence of touches and the self-reinforcement on the output layer, the representation of the object on the output layer is still unique to the cube. The first touch, at F1, results in a set of active cells on the input layer, black dots. The cells of the output layer receive this representation through their connections, black arrows. Since the input is ambiguous, the output layer forms a representation that is the junction of the cube and the wedge, black dots on the output layer. Feedback from the output layer to the input layer, red arrows, causes the location features associated with both objects to be predicted, red dots. The second touch, at F2, results in a new set of active cells in the input layer. Since F2 is not shared with the wedge, the representation in the output layer is reduced to the cube only. The set of predicted cells in the input layer is also reduced to the cube's feature location pairs. The third touch, on F3, would be ambiguous on its own. However, due to the past sequence of touches and the self-reinforcement on the output layer, the representation of the object on the output layer is still unique to the cube. The output layer represents each object by a sparse pattern. We tested the network on the first object. B. Activity in the output layer of a single column network as it touches the object. The network converges after 11 touches, red rectangle. C. Activity in the output layer of a 3-column network as it touches the object. The network converges much faster, after 4 touches, red rectangle. In both B and C, the representation in column 1 is the same as the target object representation after convergence. Mean number of observations to unambiguously recognize an object with a single column network as the set of learned objects increases. Hawkins trained models on varying numbers of objects, from 1 to 100, and plot the average number of touches required to unambiguously recognize a single object. A. The different curves show how convergence varies with the total number of unique features from which objects are constructed. In all cases, the network can eventually recognize the object, but the recognition is much faster when the set of features is greater. B. Mean number of observations to unambiguously recognize an object with multi-column networks as the set of learned objects increases. We train each network with 100 objects and plot the average number of touches required to unambiguously recognize an object. Recognition time improves rapidly as the number of columns increases. The table presents the comparison between a hierarchical temporary memory network, HTM, and a standard deep learning network. The greatest advantage of mathematical artificial neurons is that they represent clearly defined objects within a system, that communicate with each other through fully known mathematical laws, and that they comply with laws with transitivity and divisibility laws, in such a way that a system can be atomized, to the level of knowledge that the scientist on duty has. This process leads to the atomization of the system, so that a problem of large dimensionality becomes a large number of problems of very low dimensionality. Neurons communicate with other cells through synapses, specialized connections that commonly use minute amounts of chemical neurotransmitters, to pass the electrical signal from the presynaptic neuron to the target cell, across the synaptic gap. Neurons are highly specialized for the processing and transmission of cellular signals. Given their diversity of functions performed in different parts of the nervous system, there is a wide variety in their shape, size, and electrochemical properties. For instance, the soma of a neuron can vary from 4 to 100 micrometers in diameter. An artificial neuron is a mathematical function conceived as a model of biological neurons. Artificial neurons are elementary units in an artificial neural network. The artificial neuron receives one or more inputs, representing excitatory postsynaptic potentials and inhibitory postsynaptic potentials at neural dendrites, and sums them to produce an output, or activation, representing a neuron's action potential which is transmitted along its axon. Usually each input is separately weighted, and the sum is passed through a nonlinear function known as an activation function, or transfer function. The transfer functions usually have a sigmoid shape, but they may also take the form of other nonlinear functions, piecewise linear functions, or step functions. They are also often monotonically increasing, continuous, differentiable, and bounded. An artificial neural net is based on a collection of connected artificial neurons, which loosely model the neurons of a biological brain. Each connection, like the synapses in a biological brain, can transmit a signal to other neurons. An artificial neuron receives signals, then processes them, and can send to neurons connected to it. The signal at a connection is a real number, and the output of each neuron is computed by some nonlinear function of the sum of its inputs. The connections are called edges. Neurons and edges typically have a weight that adjusts as learning proceeds. The weight increases or decreases the strength of the signal at a connection. Neurons may have a threshold such that a signal is sent only if the aggregate signal crosses the threshold. Defining parameters and topology is a combination of empirical work and scientific work, but there is no mathematical theory that must be respected. The algorithmic process is cyclical, and its convergence is based on the minimization of errors. Starting from the traditional artificial neuron, to build artificial brains, Hai has created a new type of neuron. This new type of neuron will be called mathematical artificial neuron. Its name was derived from the fact that the neuron is built, based on mathematical models that represent a system, and that it contains logical or intuitive elements. The mathematical artificial neuron is a mathematical model, presumably of optimization, which results from the partitioning and decomposition of a monolithic problem into an atomized model, following the mathematical laws of large-scale mathematical modeling. Two mathematical artificial neurons communicate with each other, forming a network of mathematical artificial neurons. Communication occurs in two directions between the two neurons. The communication protocol between the two neurons is defined by mathematical laws developed to solve atomized problems. The modeler can choose the protocol, but not the communication process, which for optimization is based on the scientific laws of duality theory, and for equilibrium problems in mathematical programming with equilibrium constraints, PEC, methodologies. A mathematical neuron represents a robot, which can communicate with another robot, autonomously, since it knows the mathematical rules that it must respect. This is what happens in the human brain, where autonomic systems communicate with each other to make decisions. Like all mathematics, theory is cadent, and for those of us who already work in high-complexity mathematical modeling, it is the logical step we must take. It's just widening the look, and thinking a little outside the box. The mathematical artificial neuron is a mathematical superstructure, representing a complete system. A mathematical artificial neuron network can be a neuron of a larger mathematical artificial neuron network. This law of transitivity is typical of large-scale modeling. This process can be repeated, until the smallest mathematical artificial neurons, the atoms of the system, are obtained. A large-scale system can be represented by a mathematical artificial neuron, and covers multiple subsystems, where each of them can be represented by a mathematical artificial neuron. Using large-scale methodologies, the mathematical artificial neuron can be divided into two, or more, mathematical artificial neurons, forming a mathematical network of artificial neurons. This process can be repeated, until the smallest mathematical artificial neurons, the atoms of the system, are obtained. The diagram presents the hierarchical structure of decomposition and partition of an oil and gas company. The structure presented is similar to that of the cerebral cortex, and based on mathematical artificial neurons, any system can be represented, in a similar way to large-scale optimization models. This representation is made based on a network of mathematical artificial neurons, and could be further divided until it reaches the atoms of the system, indivisible mathematical artificial neurons. From human brains to artificial brains. Thousands of brains and artificial brains. High created mathematical artificial neural networks to give coherence to artificial brains. The study of Hawkins' work is central to the research conducted by High. A monolithic model can be associated with neocortical regions. In mathematical models, it is common to use a matrix that relates columns with variables, and equations with rows. Hawkins' theories, which have been carefully studied by High, mainly the structure of the neocortex, are the basis for the union of the components of an artificial brain. Using large-scale methodologies, the monolithic model can be visualized as a network of mathematical models, or artificial mathematical neurons. The way to connect the network of mathematical models may be associated with the way cortical regions are divided. Hierarchies can be associated with multiples views of the same system, as proposed by Jeff Hawkins. It seems normal that, to recognize the pattern of physical objects, the five senses are used, each of which will have its own model, and working cooperatively all identify a unique object. If we assume that reality has several important points of view, one of them should be selected as the main one. The problem of his choice must be faced. This is to define which is the best hierarchy to use. Hawkins' ideas led to the creation of the multi-Benders decomposition algorithm, MBD, whose coordination is like that carried out in many companies where central planning must comply with multiple planning dimensions, which must be attended simultaneously by multiple divisions, or departments. From a parallel computing standpoint, each subproblem can be associated with a core configuration, or CPU, that simultaneously generates asynchronous information to solve a common problem, such as the human brain. Considering the vision of large-scale optimization as multiple points of view, High developed the Benders multi-decomposition methodology. In simple multi-level Bender theory, in many cases there is no obvious hierarchical order for partitioning. MBD is a new approach that takes advantage of formulating multiple equivalent problems, one for each point of view, and formulating an extended coordinator model that integrates all points of view. Thinking in the thousands brain of Hawkins and consider a global multi-business company in which the general control of the company is carried out through the board of directors. For directors, 3 points of view are the most important. The company operates in 3 markets: electricity, gas and oil. Operates in several regions, and administratively is managed in several departments. From the point of view of traditional partitioning methodologies, such as standard benders, you need to choose a point of view, a criterion, to begin the partitioning process. In this case, there are 3 possibilities. The partitioning process implies that the problem from one point of view is represented with several models, depending on the number of entities that make up the point of view. For example, for business case, 3 models are required: electricity, gas and oil. Partitioning and the decomposition of a system can occur in multiple ways, without there being a mathematical reason to select one as the best. The diagram presents a system that can be sorted hierarchically by 3 alternative criteria: business, regions, and functions. Alternatively, it is possible to choose another hierarchy: regions, business, and functions. It is important to note that in both cases it is met. The last layer, the sensory one, is the same since it corresponds to the atoms of the system. These could not change according to the point of view. The upper layer, the coordinators, is partially the same, since in each of them, the information corresponding to the alternative point of view is missing. The advantage multi-decomposition arises when subproblems are solved based on an asynchronous parallel approach. In this case, each time a problem is solved, a cutting plane is included in the coordinator problem, in such a way that the number of mathematical elements included depends on the optimization process, the number of cores used, the numbers of vision of the system, and the structure of each of the subproblems. To solve complex mathematical optimization problems associated to large enterprises, the optimization problem may be decomposed using different point of views. In many cases, there is no obvious hierarchical order: first business after regions and finally functions? Or first regions then business and finally functions? Or the algebraic formulation depends on the hierarchical order, but the optimal solution must be the same regardless of the point of view. Then, it is possible to modify the standard large-scale methodologies. All models refer to the same system, or firm, and are therefore equivalent. Then, it is possible to modify the standard large-scale methodologies to simultaneously handle all the models, and improve the solution of the integrated problem. The 3 models can be integrated to include mathematical elements from the different points of view, and they could speed off the solution process, and to have a better vision of the system. The artificial hypothalamus can be extended to handle all the problems that are generated as a sequence of the multi-benders decomposition implementation. Multi-benders decomposition theory and Industry 4.0. Under the principles of Industry 4.0, this corresponds to solve real-life problems under the real-time distributed optimization scheme, in which multiple agents take real-world information, big data coming from Internet of Things, to intelligently adapt to the permanent changes that occur in the real world. Hebb unsupervised learning and Hopfield networks. Donald Olding Hebb is best known for his theory of Hebbian learning, which he introduced in his classic work The Organization of Behavior in 1949. Hebb has been described as the father of neuropsychology and neural networks. The central concept of Hebb's theory is summed up in the phrase, "cells that fire together, wire together." According to this idea, when an A neuron is repeatedly involved in the activation of a B neuron, the synapses between them are strengthened. Hebb's theory has shown that learning does not increase the number of neurons, but it does increase the connectivity between them. Hebb concludes that the persistence, or repetition of a repetitive activity, or signal, tends to induce long-lasting cellular changes, which promote its stability. When an axon of a neuron A is close enough to excite a neuron B and repeatedly participates in its activation, processes of growth, or metabolic change, occur in one or both neurons, so that the efficiency of A to excite B increases. The central concept of Hebb's theory is summed up in the phrase, cells that fire together, wire together. According to this idea, when an A neuron is repeatedly involved in the activation of a B neuron, the synapses between them are strengthened. This principle suggests that the concurrence of neural activity is the basis for learning and memory. Synaptic strengthening: when a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron are activated simultaneously, the connections between them are strengthened. Activity-dependent plasticity: the efficiency of synaptic connections is not static but can be modified as a function of neuronal activity. This plasticity is essential for adaptive learning and memory. Then, learning is not about new cells, but about new connections. Because of the creation of new and more efficient connections in the brain. Experience induces synaptic change. Synaptic change facilitates pattern competition. Activity, not synaptic change, is sufficient for memory cognition. How Hopfield neural networks learn? Hopfield's seminal paper is Neural Networks and Physical Systems with Emerging Collective Computational Capabilities. Published in 1982. Given the dynamical electrochemical properties of neurons and their interconnections, synapses, we readily understand schemes that use a few neurons to obtain elementary useful biological behavior. Our understanding of such simple circuits in electronics allows us to plan larger and more complex circuits which are essential to large computers. Because evolution has no such plan, it becomes relevant to ask whether the ability of large collections of neurons to perform computational tasks may in part be a spontaneous collective consequence of having a large number of interacting simple neurons in physical systems made from a large number. Hopfield networks are a form of recurrent neural networks that hold a prominent place in the history of artificial intelligence and artificial neural networks. They represented a significant advance in understanding how neural networks composed of simple, interconnected neurons could process information collectively. This model was inspired by both biology and physics. The Hopfield network consists of binary threshold neurons, meaning they have two states, on or off, with each neuron interconnected, forming a fully interconnected network. This Hopfield ANN is characterized by associative ANN, unsupervised offline learning of the Hebbian type, monolayer, which means that neurons are input and output, and have no hidden layers, and to communicate with each other, neurons have lateral connections, but they do not have connections with themselves, they are not recursive. During the learning process the ANN does not require cycles, iterations, but it does require an operation. The Hopfield network consists of binary threshold neurons, meaning they have two states, on or off, with each neuron interconnected, forming a fully interconnected network. The flow of information in the Hopfield ANN is Hopfield energy is equal to new energy that upgrade rule that generates the transformer. An example of an ANN Hopfield application is pattern recognition. The paper, and the paper video. Hopfield networks is all you need. Present a good introduction to Hopfield networks. Another video that explains how the Hopfield RNA works. How are memories stored in neural networks? The Hopfield network. Another video that explains how the Hopfield RNA works. How are memories stored in neural networks? The Hopfield network. How high algorithms learn? Unsupervised learning, as part of the research process on artificial business brains, which aims to provide businesses with the ability to lean on artificial management across the organization. HI has developed the ability to manage the generation of knowledge that produces large-scale optimization algorithms. In essence, this type of learning is unsupervised, but in its use, it can be improved by giving it the ability to supervise, creating a new level of learning for the selection of knowledge to be used in each new execution, based on Hopfield's neural networks. Tribute to Hernando Duran Castro, my master's professor, in 1975, at the Universidad de los Andes. Nothing is necessary, nothing is enough, everything is useful. Always must learn. I added. May he rest in peace.